Hey guys, tonight we aren't just reading about history. We're stepping right into it, specifically into the horrifying, exhausting, and utterly bizarre life of a chambermaid in the court of Marie Antoinette at Versailles.
There's
You're not
no
going to be
time for
wearing a fancy
idleness.
ball
Now
gown.
get to work.
You're wearing scratchy wool and a lifetime of regret, all while fighting off an army of fleas. Picture this, you've just arrived in the most glittering palace in the world, having traveled for days, and you're stepping out of a muddy carriage. The air isn't perfumed with roses like the paintings suggest. No, you immediately feel this heavy, damp, almost metallic scent. It's a mix of stale urine, cheap tallow candles, unwashed bodies, and the faint, unsettling sweetness of too much expensive perfume trying to cover it all up. Versailles is a colossal machine of masonry and delusion, and tonight you are its lowest gear. This isn't a museum trip. This is your life now.
Matter.
You look up at the palace walls,
You
and they
dare
are simply
challenge my
overwhelming
authority?
acres of gilded carving marble and glass reflecting the sickly yellow light. You see the famous Hall of Mirrors, but what you feel is the sheer impossible scale of the place. It's a city masquerading as a house. You're here because your cousin's uncle's patron needed a new pair of hands for the Queen's service, and suddenly that's you. Congratulations. You've won the worst lottery in 18th century France. The first thing you realize is that the floor plan of Versailles makes absolutely no logical sense. It's a labyrinth of privilege. The marble grand staircase is reserved for the nobles. You, however, are quickly shoved toward a servant's staircase, a steep, narrow, dark, and greasy spiral, known simply as the escalier dérobé, the secret staircase. You trudge up it, your tired legs burning, carrying your meager bundle of belongings, feeling the grit of centuries under your cheap shoes. You probably won't survive this job, by the way. The physical labor, the infectious disease, the toxic cosmetics you'll be handling, or maybe just the sudden, unpredictable malice of a bored noble, any of it could finish you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are tonight and what your local time is. We're about to travel back to 1780s France, and I want to know who's on this journey with me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're finally assigned to the Queen's private apartments. The sheer scale of the waste is the first shock. Think about all the paper plates you use at a summer BBQ. Now imagine a court of thousands of people, and everything is used once and tossed. The floors are already swept, technically, but you can still spot layers of dust mixed with hair droppings and the odd, forgotten silk ribbon. The whole palace operates on this surface-level glamour where the illusion of cleanliness is more important than the actual cleaning. Your direct superior is likely the first chambermaid, a formidable woman named Madame Campan, or someone similar whose power over your life is total. She doesn't introduce you, she just points with a dismissive gesture. Your job. Endless fetching, carrying, cleaning up after the Queen's small, fluffy pets, and maintaining the chambre de parade, the ceremonial bedroom which is, ironically, almost never slept in. The real bedroom is smaller, warmer, and thankfully more private. But even here, privacy is a joke. You see, the Queen Marie Antoinette is a spectacle. Every moment of her life is a performance, and you are part of the supporting cast. She can't cough without 10 people taking notes. This relentless observation means your mistakes are also observed, and your mistake could mean your swift dismissal, or worse. You're given a tiny, cramped space in the attic, what they call the galetas. It's several flights above the Queen's rooms, sharing air with hundreds of other overworked servants. The heat in summer is oppressive. The cold in winter is a bone-aching menace. You share a pallet with at least two other women, and the smell of their feet and unwashed linen is immediately your new normal. You have maybe 4 hours of true darkness before you are shaken awake. You have to be silent. Silence is your armor. Even the rustle of your petticoats is too loud. The Queen herself is famous for being easily irritated by noise, which is a funny quirk for a woman who lived in the noisiest building on earth. But that's the thing about the aristocracy. Their comfort is absolute, and your existence is an inconvenience. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The construction of Versailles was started by Louis XIV, the Sun King, and it was deliberately designed not just as a residence, but as a political tool to centralize power and keep the fractious French nobility distracted and under surveillance, forcing them to spend all their money on courtly fashions and duties. It's less a home, more a massive, glittering prison for the aristocracy. The quirky or fringe tidbit you learn almost immediately is about the mirrors. They're not for you. In fact, many servants believed looking directly into the palace's grand mirrors brought bad luck. The real quirk, though, is how often servants would simply get lost and then accidentally walk into a room where some minor noble was having a very private, very loud argument. You have to learn to glide to become part of the wallpaper and to develop an almost supernatural ability to know which hallway is safe and which one is already occupied by someone more important than you. Finally, the open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the infamous Parc aux Cerfs, the so-called Deer Park, was a formalized royal brothel managed for Louis XV's pleasure, or if it was simply a series of private apartments where he conducted discreet affairs, the truth of which was amplified and corrupted by anti-monarchy propaganda. For you, the Maid, it's just another building you're glad you don't have to clean. You close your eyes for what feels like a minute, and then a hand is shaking your shoulder. It's 5:30 a.m. The Queen will be awake soon, and you, the lowly chambermaid, have a world of unpleasant tasks waiting. The first task, making sure the royal chamber is free of, well, let's just say the guests are not always human. You're shaking off the grit of the attic pallet and immediately descending back down the escalier dérobé. The first light is barely visible, but the palace is already a humming hive of activity. Not the glamorous sort you'd expect, but the panicked, efficient scurry of thousands of servants. Your initial, most pressing duty before the Queen even stirs involves the grim reality of personal hygiene in 18th century Versailles, or rather the lack thereof. You see, the palace has roughly 2,000 to 3,000 residents on any given day, and guess what? There are almost no indoor plumbing facilities as we understand them. The Queen has a private chaise per se, a sort of commode, but for everyone else, and for much of the night, chambers pots are the rule. Your task is the constant, never-ending emptying of these, but more immediately, you have to deal with the inevitable and frankly shocking consequence of so many people living in such close quarters with so little running water vermin. The war against pests is your primary silent duty. You are a foot soldier in the vermin patrol. Fleas, lice, and rats are not just problems. They are simply part of the landscape. They infest the straw-stuffed mattresses, the thick velvet curtains, the untouched dusty corners, and most intimately, the thick, elaborate clothing of the aristocracy. You spend the early morning hours with a small, sharp instrument, picking lice out of the Queen's ceremonial bedding, and sometimes even out of the seams of the gown she wore the previous day. And the irony, the nobles rarely bathed. They believed that water could actually carry disease into the body through the pores. Instead, they relied on dry cleanings, rubbing their skin with linen or silk, and most importantly, perfume. Gallons and gallons of expensive French perfume to mask the truly spectacular stench. You watch as a high-ranking lady glides by a vision in silk and powder, and a tiny, almost imperceptible cloud of eau de toilette follows her, trying desperately to overpower the smell of month-old sweat. It's a losing battle. It's like trying to fight a forest fire with a decorative watering can. The Queen, bless her heart, was actually more hygienic than many of her peers, a fun little fact often left out of the revolutionary pamphlets. She was known to take baths more frequently than most, perhaps once a month, which by court standards was practically a daily scrub. Still, it falls to you to lay out the clean chemises, the undergarments that were changed daily, and were meant to absorb the body's oils and sweat, acting as the primary barrier between filth and fashion. The upper classes considered changing these linen items a form of bathing. You have to suppress a giggle when you think about how utterly pointless their complex grooming rituals are when they are literally crawling with tiny creatures. They carry small ornate tools called flea traps or flea furriers, small boxes of scented fur that were meant to lure the pests away from their bodies. Sometimes they even had tiny poudreuses powder puffs filled with insecticidal powder for their pets, which is a level of absurdity that only 18th century French royalty could achieve. Your hands, by contrast, are rough and scarred from constant hard scrubbing with harsh lye soap. You don't have time for perfume. You smell like ammonia, wet wool, and exhaustion. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The high-powdered wigs and hairstyles were a massive breeding ground for lice. To combat this, noblemen and women would sometimes use little ornate silver scoops to scratch their heads, a practice known as the scratching of the skull. These wigs weren't cleaned often, they were just repowdered, essentially baking the filth inside. It's a marvel of historical grossness. The quirky or fringe tidbit is about how they dealt with bad teeth. Since sugar was incredibly expensive and a status symbol, Marie Antoinette loved gâteaux. Aristocratic teeth suffered horribly. Instead of dental care, they would sometimes simply paste a small piece of velvet over a rotting tooth to hide the gap or decay, especially before sitting for a portrait. It's a Band-Aid solution that sums up the entire regime, really. You finally get to your one moment of quiet reflection, which is cleaning the Queen's mirrors. This involves using water mixed with vinegar or sometimes even stale bread mashed into a paste, a truly tedious task because the mirrors at Versailles are massive, and everywhere multiplying the Queen's grandeur and, coincidentally, your workload. As you wipe the surface, you catch your own reflection, a fleeting, tired, smudged face that the Queen would never truly see. You are invisible, and that invisibility is your only protection. The open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the high rates of infant mortality among royal children in this era were primarily due to infectious diseases carried by the constant flow of people through court or the relatively sterile, bland diet imposed by royal physicians who often prohibited fresh fruits and vegetables. Either way, you, the maid, know the filth is a factor. A bell rings sharp and demanding. It's time for the next act. Le lever, the Queen's waking ceremony. Your hands are rough, your stomach is empty, and the smell of the palace's underlying decay is still clinging to you, but you smooth down your apron and prepare to enter the orbit of the most observed woman in France. The bell for the Queen's waking le lever is the sound that immediately triples the speed of every servant within earshot. This is not just Marie Antoinette waking up. It's the start of the daily theatrical performance that justifies the entire system of monarchy. You have scrubbed the surfaces, dispatched a few unfortunate pests, and now you must present yourself for the ceremony itself. You glide into the Queen's chambre de parade, the ceremonial bedroom, which is a glorious, gilded box of high ritual. Your low rank means you are allowed in, but you must keep to the periphery, a silent shadow near the door or tucked against a curtain, ready to move when needed, but never to be seen as present. This is where the hierarchy of the court becomes immediately rigidly apparent, and it's a masterclass in controlled awkwardness. The actual waking has a precise order, a sort of reversed fashion show where clothes are put on, not taken off. First, a high-ranking noblewoman, perhaps the Lady of Honor or the superintendent, is the only person permitted to assist the queen directly with her shift. Then, as the morning progresses, layers of clothing are brought in, and the privilege of handing them to the queen descends the social ladder. Imagine this. Marie Antoinette is standing there, draped in a simple, fine linen shift, waiting for her morning gown. The First Lady of the bedchamber approaches, holding the gown, but just as she is about to hand it over, Duchess of Provence sweeps in. The Duchess, being a princess by marriage, outranks the Lady of the bedchamber, so the Lady of the bedchamber must step back. The Duchess takes the gown, but wait. A distant cousin of the king, say the Countess of Artois, enters. She outranks the Duchess, so the Duchess must step back. The Countess takes the gown. The Queen, meanwhile, stands there, freezing in her shift, perhaps, with a gentle, slightly impatient sigh, watching three of the most powerful women in France play this bizarre game of human hot potato with her silk dress. This elaborate, tedious pause is the entire point. It's a moment designed to remind everyone who is who and how close or how far they are from the ultimate source of power, the body of the queen. You, the chambermaid, are so far down the line that your job is simply to prepare the room, make sure the fires are burning evenly in the hearth, and be ready to snatch a dropped item before it hits the floor. You would never touch the queen's outer clothing during the ceremony. That level of intimacy is reserved for titles, not toil. Your hands only touch the linen, the soap, and the silver tray that holds the morning chocolate. This routine, this almost religious adherence to etiquette, is what bored the young queen to tears, and it's what she eventually tried to escape by retreating to her private domain, the Little Trianon. But in the 1780s, much of the ceremony is still enforced, and you are a willing, if exhausted, participant in this absurdity. It's all about face. Everyone in the room is performing for everyone else. The nobles are performing their status for the queen. The queen is performing her regal patience for the nobles, and you are performing your invisibility for everyone. If you stumble, if you cough, if you even let your eyes linger on the queen's face for too long, you have committed an error of state. Your job during le lever is to monitor the temperature of the queen's hot chocolate, which is a delicate process. It must be warm enough to be pleasant, but not so hot that it might burn her delicate palate, a culinary tightrope walk. You realize that hundreds of years of absolute monarchy have essentially led to the ultimate invention of performative customer service. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The ritual of le lever, the waking and le coucher, the bedding dated back to King Louis XIV, and was deliberately designed to maintain the court's hierarchy and schedule, ensuring the king's entire day was a public demonstration of his power and accessibility. Marie Antoinette found it especially galling because she was Austrian, and her native court traditions were less ridiculously formal. The quirky or fringe tidbit involves the morning chocolate. The chocolate served at court was often mixed with spices, sometimes even a touch of ambergris, a waxy substance found in the digestive system of sperm whales, which was prized for its rich, musky scent and believed to have aphrodisiac qualities. So you are essentially preparing a very expensive, slightly whale-flavored energy drink for the queen. And finally, the open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue, Whether Marie Antoinette's attempts to simplify the court dress and reduce the formality of the lever were genuine attempts at reform and comfort, or merely another expensive fashion trend, the invention of simplicity as the ultimate, most exclusive luxury item available only to a queen. The morning ritual finally concludes. The nobles have performed their duties and now float off to their own breakfasts and endless rounds of gossip. The queen is dressed. Your shift is placed carefully folded in the linen press. The door closes and you are left to stare at the remnants of this grand scene. You have earned maybe 20 minutes of relative quiet before the next grueling task begins, the monumental struggle with the queen's wardrobe. The brief respite after le lever is over and your attention snaps immediately to the sheer terrifying bulk of the queen's wardrobe. You've cleaned the room and served the chocolate, but now you face the true physical embodiment of royal excess, the gowns, the corsets, and the panniers. This is where fashion stops being fun and starts becoming a weapon against you and against the queen's own body. Your first battle is usually with the corset. This isn't a modern, soft piece of lingerie. It's a terrifying cage of whalebone and stiff canvas designed to contort the human torso into an unnaturally small, perfect cone. You are one of the two maids whose job it is to pull the laces. You brace your feet, take the heavy silk cords, and you pull. You have to pull until the queen's waist measures what high fashion dictates, a painful, breath-robbing process that often leaves the queen flushed and gasping and you with aching shoulders. You can feel the bone and muscle shifting under your hands. It's a moment of unsettling, intense physical intimacy with a woman who is otherwise completely inaccessible. Imagine being cinched so tightly that your organs shift and you can only take shallow breaths. This is a daily reality for the queen. If you pull too tight, you could cause her to faint in public, a massive scandal. If you pull too loose, the queen's dress won't sit right, and you risk a stinging reprimand from the mistress of the robes, a woman who treats fabric with more respect than she treats you. Once the corset is secure, the real architectural nightmare begins, the panniers. These are the gigantic whalebone or wicker hoops that extend the skirt dramatically sideways, sometimes making the queen wider than she is tall. They were essentially hip extenders designed to make the waist look even tinier and to consume vast quantities of expensive silk. Getting the queen into a dress over these panniers is like trying to put a fitted sheet onto a moving sculpture. You have to lift, pivot, and maneuver the queen in the garment, ensuring the thousands of tiny, delicate stitches and the precious embroidery aren't ripped. And the fabric itself, it's not just cloth. It's silk taffeta, shot through with gold thread, heavy velvet or shimmering brocade, often woven with patterns representing the king's ships or the latest royal mistress. Just kidding, but only slightly. These gowns often weigh more than you do easily, 15 to 20 pounds, before you even add the jewels and trimmings. This monumental weight and restriction are entirely intentional. It's fashion as political control. A woman constrained by such an elaborate costume is effectively removed from any truly strenuous activity she can't run. She can barely sit down without a team of people to arrange her skirts, and she certainly can't escape. Her clothes make her a spectacle, a gilded doll, and her very immobility broadcasts her status. She does not need to lift a finger for herself. That is your job. You are constantly reminded of the cost. A tiny tear in the fabric, a smudge of dirt from your clumsy handling, or a wrinkle where there should be smooth perfection, and the gown is ruined, a financial loss equivalent to your entire salary for several years. You move with agonizing care, your hands sweating slightly from the pressure. You realize that your entire existence hangs on the integrity of a silk thread. You learn to hate the pins, Thousands of tiny sharp pins are used to secure ruffles, tuck folds, and create the illusion of effortless perfection. You often nick the queen's skin, a tiny draw of blood on her shoulder, which she ignores with a royal flinch, but which sends a wave of panic through you. You've just wounded the body of France, even if it's just a scratch. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The panniers reached their most ridiculous cartoonish width in the 1770s before Marie Antoinette popularized the slightly narrower robe à la polonaise. At their peak, a woman wearing the widest panniers could not pass through a normal doorway without turning sideways, a clear visual demonstration of their owner's wealth and detachment from ordinary practicality. The quirky or fringe tidbit involves the colors. The Queen often introduced new colors to the court, naming them after current events. For instance, after the birth of her son, the Dauphin, a popular shade of mud brown, was known as caque dauphin, Dauphin's poop, which is a truly remarkable name to wear to a formal ball. You often had to distinguish between shades with names like stifled sigh or a complaining widow, and the open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the massive expenditure on court clothing and accessories, which provided employment to thousands of Parisian silk weavers and artisans, was a necessary economic stimulus for the French luxury trade or an ultimately unsustainable drain on the royal treasury that fueled revolutionary resentment. For you, it's just a mountain of laundry. Finally, the gown is in place, the petticoats are arranged, and the Queen is magnificent. You breathe a shallow, corset-like sigh of relief. But the work is far from over. Her clothing is a masterpiece, but the next step is even more precarious, the literal architecture of the Queen's famous hair. With the Queen's body encased in whalebone and silk, your focus now shifts upward to the truly precarious masterpiece that sits atop her neck, her hair. This is the realm of the coiffeur Léonard Autier, a man whose artistic temperament is as volatile as the towering creation he designs, but while Leonard gets the credit, you, the chambermaid, do the grunt work. This is the age of the pouf, a hairstyle that started as tall and ended up genuinely architectural. Think less hairstyle, more mobile tower. The most extreme versions could reach 3 feet in height, requiring ladders and scaffolding just to assemble them. Today's pouf might feature intricate braids, hundreds of curls, and masses of false hair imported from peasants' hair from horses, and hair from anyone desperate enough to sell it. Your job begins with the grease and the foundation. The Queen's natural hair is too fine to hold the weight, so you and the other maids begin by applying massive quantities of pomade, a thick waxy grease made from animal fat, often bear grease if you want a truly unsettling detail. This pomade is smeared into the hair to give it substance, which, by the way, will make the Queen's hair incredibly difficult to wash, a process that happens maybe once a month. After the pomade, you apply the false pieces. These are wire frames, cushions, and pre-styled hairpieces attached to the Queen's head with sharp combs and dozens of pins. You must work quickly, ensuring the foundations are solid. One misplaced cushion or one wobbly frame, and the entire structure could tilt, which again is an immediate cause for dismissal. The pouf isn't just about height, it's about narrative. The Queen, always reflecting the times, would have the pouf decorated with small, elaborate, miniature scenes. Today, perhaps it's the Gainsborough hat style, or maybe a design commemorating a recent naval victory, a miniature ship sailing on a sea of powder-white curls. You delicately place the tiny, expensive ornaments, porcelain birds, miniature fruit baskets, or even tiny dolls representing her children. The pins are everywhere. It's an act of faith that you don't pierce the Queen's scalp. You also have to deal with the constant cloud of hair powder. This powder, often made from ground starch flour, is scented with various perfumes and used to give the hair its distinct white or silvery gray color. It gets everywhere. You breathe it in, it settles on your clothes, and it turns your own hair white by the end of the morning. It's a messy, choking, dusty process that feels more like preparing pastry than dressing a queen. You realize the dangerous aspect of this look, the poof, is essentially a flammable haystack perched on a noble skull. Given the reliance on flickering candles for light in the palace, tales of women accidentally setting their enormous hairstyles on fire are depressingly common. You must remain vigilant, holding a large fan or a piece of silk up behind the queen if she gets too close to an open flame. You are a human fire shield for a spectacular scented fire hazard. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The most famous poof was the pouf à la belle poule, a style Marie Antoinette adopted in 1778 to celebrate the French naval victory over the English ship HMS Arethusa. It featured a detailed miniature model of the victorious French frigate La Belle Poule, proudly sailing on top of her curls, clearly demonstrating her political, if frivolous, patriotism. The quirky or fringe tidbit involves the inhabitants of the poof. Because the hair was only cleaned every few weeks, the pomade and powder created a cozy, warm environment. It was an established joke, and a reality that small rodents, sometimes mice, would occasionally take up residence in the larger hairstyles. The queen's ladies had to be careful when moving suddenly, lest a tiny friend tumble out onto the floor. The open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the extreme nature of the poof was primarily a status symbol designed to physically distance the wearer from the lower classes, or if it was in fact a deliberate artistic expression by the queen and her hairdresser intended to drive Parisian fashion and defy the traditional conservatism of the Ancien Régime court. Finally, Leonard steps back, dramatically waving his perfumed hands. The structure is complete. It is breathtaking absurd and probably giving the queen a headache. You carefully brush the stray powder off the gown, a painstaking process. The queen's head is now an edifice, a beautiful monument to excess. She is now ready to face the world, but first she needs her face. And that's another story of beauty and toxicity. The towering poof is complete, but the queen's transformation into the absolute symbol of French majesty requires one last essential layer, the face. You move from the architectural realm of hair to the dangerous chemical compound of 18th century cosmetics. This is not beauty. This is engineering the perfect pale mask, and you are the assistant toxicologist. The ideal of beauty at Versailles is extreme paleness. A noblewoman must look as if she has never seen a day of labor, never been kissed by the sun, and certainly never had to worry about a farmer's tan. This paleness is achieved through a thick white face paint known as cerusse or Venetian lead. You are responsible for mixing and applying this compound. You take the white paste, which is essentially powdered white lead mixed with vinegar and egg white, and work it onto the queen's skin. You can't help but notice the telltale sign of prolonged use. The skin beneath the makeup is starting to look gray and lifeless. This is because lead is a heavy metal poison, and it is slowly leaching into her system, causing nerve damage, memory loss, and that subtle, decaying pallor you are trying to cover up, but you cannot stop. A pale face is a political statement. It says, I am so rich, I can afford to poison myself slowly with imported makeup, and I have thousands of servants to cater to me while I do it. Next comes the rouge. To offset the deathly white mask, the queen applies a striking high-contrast blush, a bright, almost theatrical red circle applied high on the cheeks. This rouge is often made from carmine derived from crushed cochineal insects or sometimes cinnabar, which is mercury sulfide. Yes, you are painting your queen with lead and mercury. You hand her the small, flat brush, and she applies the rouge herself with practiced, bold strokes. The placement of the rouge is another rigid code of the court. A married woman wears it high and close to the eyes. A girl to be wed wears a different pattern. Even the amount of rouge is a clue to the court about her current standing. It's a language you have to learn instantly. Perhaps the strangest element is the mouche, the fly, or the patch. These tiny pieces of black silk or velvet are cut into shapes: a star, a crescent moon, a carriage, or even a tiny ship. You use a specialized adhesive to delicately place one or two on the queen's face. These weren't just decorative. They were strategic. Placed near the mouth, they signified flirtation, the coquette. Placed near a corner of the eye, they meant passion, the passionate. Placed on a pimple or smallpox scar, they were a practical cover-up. You have to remember where the queen decided to place hers, as it might dictate how she wants to be perceived in that day's round of gambling and gossip. The taste, the texture, and the smell of the room during this process are unforgettable. The metallic odor of the lead, the cloying perfume of the rice powder used to finish the look, and the strange sharp scent of the mercury-based lip color, it all mixes into the atmosphere of luxury and toxicity. You also have to manage the queen's own supply of beauty secrets, which sometimes includes truly bizarre remedies. You recall having to help mix a face mask that included pigeon droppings because someone insisted it had wonderful clarifying properties. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from some earlier historical era. This is the French version. The whole ritual is a fragile, flammable, poisonous spectacle. You stand back, dusting the last trace of white powder off her heavily embroidered silk gown, and the queen is complete, a breathing, walking doll of the Ancien Régime. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The aristocracy's use of white lead makeup was so prevalent that chronic lead poisoning was common among the wealthy elite, contributing to a number of common ailments, including digestive issues, mental instability, and hair loss, which ironically necessitated the use of the extravagant wigs you just finished building. The quirky or fringe tidbit involves the preparation of the famous white powder. Since flour was often used to make the rice or starch powder for the hair, the government occasionally had to issue powder tax laws. During periods of grain shortage, this practice, using vast amounts of foodstuff to dust nobles' heads while the poor starved, became a major flashpoint for revolutionary anger. The open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue, whether Marie Antoinette's alleged gambling debts and huge expenditures on fashion and cosmetics were primarily due to personal extravagance, or if they were deliberately inflated by her political enemies both within and outside the court to destroy her reputation and, by extension, undermine the legitimacy of the entire monarchy. The queen casts one final critical glance in the ornate-looking glass. She approves of the mask. Now she is ready for her first great public engagement of the day, the spectacle of being seen eating. Your job pivots immediately from personal chemist to food arranger. The public dining is about to begin. The queen is dressed, coiffed, and painted. Now comes the bizarre performance of the public dining spectacle, or le grand couvert. Your role shifts from toxicologist and architect to a nervous waiter. This is not a relaxing meal. It's a required, awkward theatrical show where the monarch eats while the public watches. You follow the queen to the dining table in the Hall of Mirrors or a similar grand open room. You might be carrying a tray with her bread, or perhaps one of the silver pitchers containing water or wine. The table is covered in expensive linen silver serving dishes and crystal glasses. But the true focal point is the small barrier erected a few feet away behind which the spectators stand. Yes, the Queen has an audience for her lunch. Anyone who is suitably dressed, meaning anyone who hasn't been explicitly barred, can come and watch the King and Queen eat. It's a bizarre tradition meant to show the accessibility and benevolence of the monarchy, but in reality it feels like eating in a goldfish bowl. You can see the hundreds of faces pressed against the velvet ropes, whispering, pointing, and judging every bite. Your job is precision and silence. You must set down the silver plates without a clink, pour the water without a splash, and retrieve the dishes without a scrape. The slightest error is magnified by the silent audience. You move like a ghost, your arms aching from the weight of the plates, and your nerves humming from the oppressive quiet. The Queen, you notice, barely eats. She might pick at a piece of chicken or take a delicate sip of wine. Who can blame her? Trying to enjoy a meal while being scrutinized by a few hundred strangers is almost impossible. The food itself is usually sumptuous and overwhelming dozens of courses prepared by the army of chefs in the royal kitchens, but much of it goes uneaten as it's primarily for show. It gets cold quickly, and the leftovers, which are prodigious, are immediately swooped up by the high-ranking servants, a coveted perk that rarely trickles down to your level. You spend the entire duration of the meal with your gaze fixed on the floor, occasionally darting your eyes up to anticipate a need. You must know the complex rules of royal food service, who can hand the bread to the king, who must taste the wine for poison, though that responsibility usually falls to higher-ranking officers, and the precise, excruciatingly slow pace at which the meal must progress. One of the worst parts is the smell of the audience. They've been standing there packed together for an hour or more, and despite the Queen's perfumes, the collective scent of the unwashed populace drifts over the barrier. It's a jarring reminder of the outside world, a smell of damp wool and garlic that contrasts violently with the gilded room. The whole ritual is a deep well of political friction. While the Queen is performing her majestic duty of eating, the thousands of people outside the palace walls are increasingly hungry. This disparity, magnified by the pamphlets and rumors circulating throughout Paris, turns this tradition from a show of power into a powerful symbol of aristocratic indifference. You can almost hear the low, angry murmurs from the crowd, even through the thick palace walls. Here is your mainstream historical fact: the tradition of le grand couvert. The public dinner was maintained by Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, even though they personally disliked it. It was a centuries-old formality, symbolizing that the king's life belonged to his people. After the first few courses, the king would often retire to eat his preferred dishes privately, leaving the Queen to endure the show a little longer. The quirky or fringe tidbit is about the leftovers. One of the most sought-after privileges among the mid-level staff was the right to reclaim the food from the royal table. These dish scrapings were considered extremely high quality and often formed the basis of the officers' and upper servants' own dinners for the night, a stark reminder of the massive scale of food waste generated by the spectacle. And the open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue whether the Queen's public indifference during this ritual, her tendency to focus on conversation or knitting rather than the food, was a sign of her cold disdain for the public, or simply a coping mechanism for the stress and embarrassment of eating a meal under such intense structured scrutiny. The plates are cleared, the audience dissipates, and the ceremony ends. You quickly help your colleagues carry the massive silver service back to the kitchens, a terrifying journey through the dark, hot, and labyrinthine underbelly of the palace. But your work is never far from the Queen's presence. Next up, dealing with the complicated human and animal politics of her private world. You are back in the Queen's private apartments, and the atmosphere, while less formal than the public dining hall, is no less politically fraught. You must now deal with the Queen's favorites, a strange collection of pets, intimate friendships, and whispered scandals that swirl around Marie Antoinette like the dust motes in the sunbeams. Your immediate duty often involves the Queen's menagerie of animals. Marie Antoinette had a fondness for small, decorative dogs, often spaniels and poodles and maybe a few exotic birds. These aren't just pets. They are small, demanding extensions of the Queen's own privilege. You are responsible for feeding them their tiny, specially prepared meals, cleaning their ornate silk bedding, and worst of all, cleaning up their accidents. Imagine the indignity, you a human being crawling around on hands and knees, scrubbing dog mess from an Aubusson carpet that costs more than your entire lineage has earned in a century. The pets are treated with lavish affection, often sleeping right on the Queen's bed or sitting on her lap during state business, enjoying a level of comfort and proximity to power that you can only dream of. A single spoiled spaniel is more important than you are, but the true drama lies in the Queen's human favorites. You see, the court of Versailles operates entirely on proximity to the Queen, and a few individuals manage to achieve an unnerving level of intimacy. Two figures stand out, the Princesse de Lamballe and the Duchesse de Polignac. They are the Queen's closest friends, part of her private circle, and they are constantly in and out of the apartments you tend. You watch as the Queen laughs with them, sharing secrets and playing music, an almost normal scene of friendship. Yet you also observe the resentment this circle creates. These friends are showered with favors, titles, and huge financial grants, literally paid by the French treasury to be the Queen's companion. This massive visible spending on a small exclusive clique fuels the most vicious rumors in Paris. Pamphlets accuse them of everything from gambling away the nation's wealth to engaging in unnatural relationships with the Queen. You are a silent witness to their frequent long visits. You serve the small glasses of wine and arrange the card games. You hear the hushed gossip and the casual, dismissive way they talk about others at court. You realize that friendship at Versailles is also a political weapon. If the Queen likes you, you are untouchable and rich. If she doesn't, you are nobody. You learn that the quickest way to rise in court is not through talent or hard work, certainly not, but through the Queen's personal favor. This system, which bypasses the rigid structure of the Ancien Régime, is what truly angers the established old nobility, perhaps even more than it angers the starving populace. The nobility feels cheated out of their birthright to leech off the state. The sheer volume of gossip and rumor that passes through the apartment is deafening, even when unspoken. You are a sponge, absorbing every sigh, every pointed glance, every half-heard whisper about financial scandal, secret assignations, or political intrigue. Your brain is filled with more state secrets than most diplomats, and you must maintain absolute silence. If you are ever caught repeating anything, you hear a single word, you will be instantly dismissed, disgraced, and maybe even imprisoned. Your survival depends on appearing as unintelligent as possible. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The massive expenditure on the Queen's favorites, particularly the Duchesse de Polignac, who received an immense annuity and gifts for her family, became one of the key elements in the anti-monarchy propaganda. These financial grants were publicly cited as proof of the Queen's wastefulness and her foreign corrupting influence on France. The quirky or fringe tidbit involves the Queen's fondness for silkworms. At one point, Marie Antoinette became fascinated by the natural world as interpreted through the lens of extreme luxury and had a project dedicated to raising silkworms in her apartment. You were naturally tasked with the mundane, smelly job of preparing their mulberry leaves and cleaning up after them, a very delicate, strange form of agriculture performed in a gilded palace bedroom. And the open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue whether the strong attachments Marie Antoinette formed with her female friends were simply a refuge from the extreme pressures and formal loneliness of court life, or if the accusations of lesbianism leveled against her in the infamous libels libelles were entirely unfounded, political fabrications designed to destroy her moral authority. The Queen decides she needs a change of scene. The pressure of the palace is too much. She's retreating to her personal fantasy world, the Petit Trianon, and you, the maid, have to pack up to follow her there. It promises a simpler life for the Queen, but for you it means simply more work in a new, slightly unsettling setting. You have now been swept out of the grandiose, stifling confinement of Versailles and taken to the Petit Trianon, the Queen's private estate gifted to her by Louis XVI. Marie Antoinette envisioned this place as an escape, a place where she could finally shake off the crushing weight of court ceremony and live a simple, rustic life. For you, the maid, it is simply a change of scenery and an entirely new, deeply ironic set of duties. The entire estate, particularly the Hameau de la Reine. The Queen's Hamlet is an architectural expression of aristocratic fantasy. It's a perfectly picturesque artificial village of thatched roof cottages, complete with a working farm, a mill, and a dairy. It looks like a postcard, but it's fundamentally a stage set, and you are still working backstage. The Queen intends to play at being a shepherdess or a dairymaid. She wears light, flowing muslin dresses, the robe en chemise, which caused a scandal at court because they looked too much like a mere undergarment. While the Queen enjoys the idea of simplicity, the execution is anything but simple for you. For example, the animals in the hamlet, the sheep, the cows, the goats, must be perfectly groomed, perpetually clean, and often bathed in scented water. You are not just mucking stalls. You are preparing a sheep for a photo shoot. The Queen's personal flock of sheep are likely brushed and perfumed more often than you are. The dairy, where the Queen sometimes plays at making butter, must be kept spotless and perfectly arranged, always ready for her visit, even though the real difficult work of milking and churning is handled by professional staff under your supervision to ensure performative authenticity. It's all performative simplicity. The dairy equipment is made of expensive porcelain and silver, not the rough, practical wood of a real farm. The Queen's muslin dress, while looking plain, is made of the finest, most costly Indian cotton, requiring a precise and delicate laundering process that you are responsible for. It might be simple in style, but it's utterly luxurious in substance. The charade of pastoral life requires immense maintenance, and that maintenance falls directly onto your weary shoulders. You still have to manage the Queen's daily schedule, which even in this rustic retreat is surprisingly structured. The entire court, albeit a smaller version, has followed her. The etiquette hasn't vanished, it's just been repackaged. Instead of a formal lever, you might be preparing the Queen for her walk among the perfumed sheep. The absurdity is exhausting. The whole village is a 18th century equivalent of a theme park, and you are one of the unsung, overworked park employees. You begin to notice that the Queen, while genuinely seeking refuge here, is also deeply detached. She seems entirely unaware of the irony of her simple life being built upon the backbreaking labor of dozens of servants, including you. She only sees the surface, the picturesque cottage, the well-groomed animals, the fresh air. She doesn't see the servants sweating to maintain the illusion. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The construction of the Hameau de la Reine was completed in 1783 and cost a staggering sum, millions of livres. It was heavily criticized by the public as another example of the Queen's selfish extravagance, proving that she wasted the nation's money even when trying to appear virtuous and simple. The quirky or fringe tidbit you learn about the hamlet is that the cottage used by the Queen was far from rustic inside. While appearing quaint on the exterior, it was furnished with silk-covered furniture, gilded wood, and a fully functional kitchen and private library. The rustic exterior was just a thin, false facade hiding luxurious comfort. And the open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue whether the Queen's creation of the Petit Trianon and the Hamlet was a sign of her growing emotional immaturity and escapism from her royal duties, or a necessary psychological retreat that allowed her to maintain her sanity amidst the hostile, highly political environment of the main Versailles court. You finish polishing the porcelain churns in the dairy and realize that even in the middle of a fake village, you are utterly trapped. The fresh air of the countryside is a welcome change from the stench of the main palace, but the work is relentless. You are still a maid, and a maid's life is never simple. You wonder what the maids at a real farmhouse are doing, and if they're paid better than you. That thought leads you back to the cold, hard realities of your life below stairs. Leaving the Queen in her play farm, you are now forced to reckon with the harsh, unvarnished truth of life below stairs. You are a chambermaid, one of several hundred low-level domestics, and your world is a brutal counterpoint to the gilded fantasy above. Your living conditions, remember, are in the attic, the galetas. It's not the quaint, sloped-ceiling garret of a romantic novel. It's a pest-ridden, airless freezing or broiling hot warren of tiny spaces. You share a room, or perhaps just a pallet on the floor with several other women. Privacy is non-existent. You sleep in shifts, trying to ignore the constant noise of coughing whispers and the undeniable scuttling of rats. The light is poor, the sanitation is primitive, and infectious diseases like typhus, or what they call camp fever, can sweep through the servant quarters like a scythe, taking out dozens of people in a single season. The palace is magnificent, but its maintenance staff lives in a slum inside the roof. The hierarchy among the servants is as rigid and unforgiving as the one among the nobility. You, a maid attached to the Queen's personal service, are slightly higher than a scullery maid or a laundress, but you are miles below the officers of the household, the men who manage the kitchens, stables, and linen. These officers, often minor nobility themselves, treat you with disdain, and they are your primary source of orders and more often punishment. Let's talk about wages. You are paid technically, but the money is pitifully small, a few hundred livres a year at best. Most of your compensation is considered to be perks, a scratchy uniform, the roof over your head, such as it is, and the promise of a crust of bread from the kitchen. However, this pay is often delayed by weeks or even months due to the general chaos and mismanagement of the royal finances. You are literally living on credit, hoping the crown pays its bills before you starve. And the danger is real. Discipline for servants is harsh, instant, and often physical. A dropped platter, a moment of tardiness, or a single act of impertinence toward a noble, even an unintentional one, can lead to a whipping or immediate dismissal. Dismissal for you means destitution and a probable quick end in the desperate streets of Paris. The ultimate fear, though, is the letter of cachet, lettre de cachet. While typically used against political enemies, these signed orders from the king could also be used to imprison a servant indefinitely, without trial, just on the whim of a powerful master or mistress. If you see a noble staring at you with a look of bored contempt, your blood chills. You know your life is entirely disposable, and a single bored complaint could send you to the Bastille. You look at the lavish meals you serve, the silk gowns you handle, and the diamond necklaces you see on the nobles, and you can't help but contrast it with your daily reality, a diet of hard bread, weak beer, and the constant gnawing fatigue that settles deep into your bones. It's a life of endless labor, poor nutrition, and constant fear, all within 100 feet of the most ridiculous wealth in the world. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The royal court at Versailles employed between 3,000 and 4,000 servants during Marie Antoinette's reign. This massive staff was divided into dozens of departments, each with its own rigid, confusing hierarchy, often leading to power struggles and inefficiencies that contributed to the general dysfunction of the palace. The quirky or fringe tidbit involves the king's dogs. The servants had a deeply resented custom. When the king's hounds were brought in from a hunt, the junior servants often had to immediately warm the dogs' cold feet by placing them under their own cloaks or even inside their shirts. It's a truly humiliating example of the literal animal status of the lowest servants. And the open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue whether the extreme labor and poor living conditions of the palace staff directly contributed to the revolutionary ferment by radicalizing a large body of workers already inside the walls of the monarchy, or if the revolutionary impulse was driven almost entirely by the broader, starving Parisian populace outside. You finally manage to catch a few hours of sleep, but tomorrow is a day off in name only. The Queen needs something from the city, and guess who's going to get it? You have to leave the gilded, suffocating cage of Versailles and brave the increasingly hostile, hungry streets of Paris. Your day off is here, and you're quickly learning that a day off at Versailles is just a change of location for your exhaustion. The Queen, or perhaps one of her fashionable favorites, requires a specific piece of ribbon, a rare type of lace or a new volume of racy poetry, something only obtainable in the shops of Paris. So you are sent on a grueling mandated fetch quest into the volatile heart of the city. You put on your plainest, least identifiable clothing, trying to look as much like a respectable commoner as possible, though the distinct pallor of the palace and the nervous quickness of your eyes probably give you away. The trip itself is an ordeal. You take the cheapest form of transport, or more likely you walk the miles of dusty, rutted road between Versailles and Paris. It's physically taxing, and you dread the return journey, knowing you'll have to carry the delicate, expensive items safely back. As you enter the crowded, loud streets of Paris, the atmosphere is instantly and disturbingly different from the court. Versailles is stiflingly silent and perfumed. Paris is a chaotic roar of cartwheels, street hawkers, and the visceral, pervasive smell of human filth, poverty, and raw sewage. But what is truly palpable is the anger. It hangs in the air like a thick fog. You have to navigate the narrow, dark streets, keeping a tight hold on the small purse given to you for the purchase. You see the ordinary people, the sans-culottes, the workers and artisans, their faces drawn by hunger, their clothes patched and ragged. They look at you even in your plain clothes, and you feel the weight of their resentment. You are a symbol of the place they hate the Queen they curse. You hear their muttered complaints about the price of bread, which is a terrifying daily struggle for them. The price of one loaf could equal a third of a man's daily wage, and when you can't buy bread, you starve. It's that simple. Your destination might be a fashionable boutique on the Rue Saint-Honoré or the atelier of a jeweler. You step inside, and the sudden shift back to opulence is dizzying. The shopkeepers recognize you instantly. You are from the palace, and their demeanor changes. They are deferential, but you sense a deep, dangerous sarcasm behind their forced smiles. They speak highly of their queen to your face, but you see the stack of revolutionary pamphlets hidden beneath the counter when they reach for the ledger. You are forced to pay exorbitant prices. The shopkeepers know the money is royal, and they inflate the cost shamelessly. You argue weakly, knowing that the queen won't notice the extra livres, but you also know that your low wages are often docked if the purchase seems too extravagant. You manage to procure the item, a ridiculously complex piece of silk lace, perhaps, and you begin the nervous journey back. The lace is wrapped in silk, protected in a box, and you hold it like it is made of glass. Meanwhile, outside the boutique, you step over piles of garbage and avoid the open gutter that runs down the middle of the street, which is little more than a river of waste. The contrast is nauseating. The single item you carry is worth the annual income of 50 Parisian families. Here is your mainstream historical fact. During the 1780s, the price of bread in Paris fluctuated wildly, but the years 1788 to 1789 saw severe harvest failures. The cost of a 4-pound loaf of bread spiked to its highest level in over 70 years, consuming up to 88% of a laboring man's income, which was the single greatest catalyst for popular unrest. The quirky or fringe tidbit involves the pamphlets. You learn that one of the most popular forms of revolutionary literature, the libelles, often contained graphic, sometimes pornographic satires of the queen and the court. These cheap, easily distributed writings fueled public hatred by portraying Marie Antoinette as a spendthrift, a political plotter, and a sexual deviant. It's hard to reconcile the silent, polite woman you serve with the monster described on the streets. And the open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue whether the high price of bread was solely a consequence of poor harvests and poor government intervention in the grain market, the so-called flour war, or if it was partially exacerbated by speculators and monopolists who deliberately withheld grain to drive prices higher. You finally arrive back at Versailles, exhausted, dusty, and psychologically bruised by the trip. You hand over the lace, receive a curt nod of dismissal, and sink onto your pallet, your head swimming with the sights and sounds of a city on the brink. You have brought back the Queen's item, but you have also brought back a chilling, fresh understanding of the danger that is now knocking on the palace gates. The revolutionary pamphlets you saw under the counter are about to get louder. You've returned from Paris, but the whispers of the mob have followed you back to the opulent halls of Versailles. The anger you felt in the streets isn't just an external threat anymore. It's seeping into the very foundations of the palace. You are now living in a magnificent echo chamber filled with gilded fear. Your duties now include a chilling new task, carefully secretly removing and destroying the revolutionary pamphlets, libelles, that somehow manage to circulate even within the court. You find them tucked into cushions left on minor noblemen's tables or slipped under doors, filthy, cheap prints covered in furious text, and savage caricatures of the Queen. They portray Marie Antoinette as Madame Deficit, a foreign slut, who is literally bankrupting France through her lovers and her endless craving for diamonds. You glance at the crude drawings, quickly crumple the paper, and burn it in a fireplace meant for kindling your heart pounding. If you were caught with one, you'd be accused of treason. The nobles, meanwhile, are desperately trying to ignore the rumbling thunder outside. They keep up their rounds of gambling balls and theatricals, but there's a frantic, brittle quality to their enjoyment. You see them gathered in small, nervous knots, their voices low as they discuss the new, increasingly hostile speeches coming out of the burgeoning National Assembly. They debate whether they should be packing their bags for their country estates or if the king will finally order a military crackdown. The tension is so thick you could cut it with one of the Queen's diamond-encrusted letter openers. Even the most seemingly innocuous acts feel loaded. When you serve a noble their breakfast chocolate, their eyes dart to the window, watching for smoke rising over Paris. The Queen herself seems to have grown thinner, her famously fair complexion now showing the strain of anxiety beneath the ceruse makeup you apply. The palace has become a giant rumor mill. You hear stories of soldiers, French soldiers, mind you, refusing to fire on bread rioters in the city. You hear of noble families leaving in the dead of night, slipping away to Belgium or Switzerland, abandoning their post and their debts. The phrase, "it will all blow over," is a mantra for the optimists, but it sounds more like a desperate prayer. You learn quickly to distinguish between the truly dangerous rhetoric and the trivial court gossip. The dangerous talk is about privilege, the abolition of tax exemptions for the nobility. The trivial talk is about which duchess got a new diamond pin. But increasingly, the two topics are merging. The noble's pin is directly linked to the taxes the commoners refuse to pay. And your rank, your supposed privileged position as a royal servant, is now a vulnerability. You are a target. If the revolution comes to Versailles, you won't be seen as one of the poor. You'll be seen as a collaborator, a symbol of the detested regime. Your invisibility once your armor is turning into a target mark. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The meeting of the Estates General in May 1789, the legislative body that hadn't met since 1614, was intended to solve the financial crisis, but ultimately led to the formation of the National Assembly by the Third Estate, marking the true beginning of the French Revolution and the end of the king's absolute power. The quirky or fringe tidbit involves the guards. You notice that the few remaining members of the Swiss Guard, who are supposed to be the most loyal troops, are being paid in paper notes that are already losing value, and their uniforms are starting to look ragged. Their lack of morale is a hushed joke among the upper servants, but for you it's a terrifying sign of the monarchy's unraveling authority. And the open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue whether King Louis XVI's failure to rapidly deploy military force to disperse the National Assembly was an act of genuine peace-loving weakness or a shrewd realization that his own troops were already too unreliable and sympathetic to the revolutionary cause. The tension finds its focal point in a gigantic, years-old scandal that suddenly resurfaces the diamond necklace affair. Everyone is talking about it again, using it as shorthand for the Queen's corruption. You know that scandal, you remember the sheer volume of gossip it created, and you know its poisonous legacy is about to hit closer to home. The political and social pressure cooker, that is Versailles, finally finds its most perfect symbol of decay in the revival of the diamond necklace affair. Though the scandal itself occurred years ago, around 1785, the rising tide of anti-monarchy sentiment drags it back into the public consciousness, and for good reason. It perfectly encapsulates the court's mix of extravagance, incompetence, and high-level deception. You remember the endless poisonous gossip at the time. The entire story revolves around a staggering diamond necklace, so elaborate and enormous it was literally too expensive for the king to purchase outright. The necklace contained over 600 perfect diamonds and was valued at an astronomical 1.6 million livres, which, by the way, was enough to feed tens of thousands of French families for a year. The mainstream historical fact is that the Queen was, in fact, innocent of the actual theft and fraud. She had refused to buy the necklace when it was first offered, stating simply, "We have no need of such things." However, a clever, desperate adventuress named Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy, the self-proclaimed Countess de la Motte, saw an opportunity. She convinced the Cardinal de Rohan, who desperately sought the Queen's favor after years of being in her bad graces, that Marie Antoinette secretly wanted the necklace but couldn't be seen buying it publicly. The plot was a masterpiece of con artistry. De la Motte orchestrated a secret meeting in the Versailles gardens between the cardinal and a prostitute she had hired to impersonate the Queen. The prostitute, dressed in the Queen's style which you helped to create every morning, accepted the cardinal's whispered devotion and a signed note authorizing the purchase of the necklace on credit. The jewelers released the necklace to the cardinal, who then passed it to de la Motte, believing she was acting for the Queen. De la Motte promptly dismantled it and sold the diamonds in London. When the massive bills came due, the cardinal couldn't pay, and the entire ridiculous scheme fell apart. The cardinal was arrested publicly in the Hall of Mirrors, a staggering blow to the dignity of the church and the court. This is the part that terrified you. The Maid, the highest-ranking people in the country, were revealed to be greedy, gullible fools. Your role was peripheral, but you were constantly exposed to the fallout. You had to clean up the messes left by the officers interrogating witnesses. You heard the officers whisper about the Queen's own reputation, which was irrevocably tarnished by the affair. Because the Queen hated the Cardinal de Rohan, and because her life was already stained by the libels, the public absolutely refused to believe she was innocent. They preferred the easier, more satisfying narrative. The Queen, a foreign spendthrift, used a gullible cardinal to steal a massive fortune to pay her fictitious gambling debts. The court became a theater of accusations and paranoia. Nobles stopped trusting each other. Everyone was looking over their shoulder, fearful of being caught up in the next wave of official arrests, or worse, unofficial slanders. The affair did more to destroy the Queen's popular image than years of actual legitimate overspending. The entire Ancien Régime was put on trial with the Countess de la Motte, and it was found guilty. Here is your quirky or fringe tidbit. During her own trial, the Countess de la Motte, in a truly brazen act, was convicted and branded with a V for Volus thief. However, her celebrity was so immense that she escaped prison, wrote a famous memoir defaming the Queen, and became a figurehead for the anti-monarchy movement, showing that a good scandal could literally launch a career. The open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the Parliament of Paris's decision to acquit Cardinal de Rohan while condemning de la Motte was a legitimate judicial finding that simply embarrassed the monarchy, or a calculated political move by the judiciary who resented the king's authority to publicly humiliate Marie Antoinette. The scandal is old, but its political poison is fresh. The populace is convinced the king and queen are financially and morally bankrupt. You keep finding those damning pamphlets now with fresh ink referring to the Austrian woman and her stolen diamonds. The fear and hatred are no longer whispers. They are becoming a constant background noise. The walls of Versailles are about to prove that they are not strong enough to keep the revolution out. You brace yourself, feeling the ground tremble. You know the night of true terror is coming. The pre-dawn hours of October 5th, 1789 are a day you will never forget. All the whispering, the pamphlets, the gossip, and the slow, agonizing decay of the monarchy have culminated in a terrifying, sudden reality. The mob is no longer outside the city. The mob is marching on Versailles. You are woken not by the usual insistent bell for the laver, but by a frantic, terrifying clamor. It is a noise unlike anything you have ever heard, a mixture of thousands of shouting, cursing voices, the drumming of rain-soaked feet, and the rattling of makeshift weapons. The Women's March on Versailles, a massive crowd of primarily Parisian market women and revolutionary activists, has arrived demanding bread and demanding to see the baker and the baker's wife, meaning the king and queen. You rush to the queen's apartment. The atmosphere among the high-ranking staff is one of paralyzed panic. Nobles are screaming, trying to secure their jewels and their lives, completely abandoning any semblance of courtly dignity. Your own fear is cold and metallic in your mouth, but years of rigid training kick in, so you must dress the queen. Marie Antoinette herself has surprisingly composed a rare moment of genuine, non-performative calm. She is quickly dressed not in ceremony, but in clothes suitable for flight. Your hands, usually slow and deliberate with the silks and corsets, work with frantic speed. You feel the palace shaking, not just from the noise, but from the physical violation of the gates being smashed open. The main objective is to get the queen and the royal children from their private apartments to the king's fortified chambers across the palace, but the path is blocked. The women have broken into the palace. You hear the terrible, visceral sounds of fighting the clash of the remaining Swiss guards against the crowd, the cries of the wounded, and the rhythmic, terrifying stampede of people running through the corridors you once cleaned in silent, terrified reverence. The mainstream historical fact is that the invaders broke into the palace through unsecured side gates, targeting the queen's apartments first. They brutally murdered 2 of the gardes du corps, bodyguards, directly outside her door, their heads later paraded on pikes in a grotesque display. You, the maid, are directly in the path of this raw, uncontrolled violence. You and the other women managed to lead the queen and her children through a hidden, narrow passage that connects her apartments to the king's rooms. This escalier, dérobé, the secret staircase you know so well, the same one you trudge up every morning, is now a lifeline. You push through the dark, cramped passage, tripping over your own feet, pulling the queen's young son, the Dauphin, close to your side. The smell of gun smoke and blood is now mixing with the familiar scent of unwashed bodies and fear. Once in the king's chambers, the doors are barricaded. You huddle in a corner, catching your breath, listening to the relentless pounding outside. The King Louis XVI appears. He is forced to walk out onto the balcony with the queen and the children to face the 1,000-strong crowd below. It is a moment of pure, terrifying confrontation. The quirky or fringe tidbit you notice in the chaos is the strange behavior of some of the royal pets. The queen's favorite little spaniel, usually so pampered and fearful of loud noises, is actually barking aggressively at the door, trying to protect its mistress, a final, futile gesture of loyalty in a building where human loyalty is completely dissolved. Finally, the shouting subsides into an unnerving chorus. To Paris, to Paris. The mob demands that the royal family relocate immediately to the capital, where they can be kept under the care of the people. The king has no choice but to agree. The flight from Versailles is not a ceremonial procession. It's a humiliation. You are shoved into one of the carriages that will accompany the royal family. As you look back at the palace, your home for years, you see a building that is broken, violated, and utterly defeated. The furniture is smashed, the curtains ripped, and the gold tarnished. Versailles is empty, and the great Ancien Régime is essentially over. The open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue whether the women's initial march on Versailles was primarily motivated by the genuine economic crisis and the desperate need for bread, or if it was expertly organized and strategically guided by radical political leaders in Paris, who sought to politically control the king. You are now on the road to Paris, not as a servant of a glorious court, but as a prisoner accompanying her royal captors. The next chapter of your horrifying life will be played out in a gilded cage in the heart of the revolutionary city. The journey from Versailles to Paris was a terrifying ordeal. You were packed into a lumbering carriage surrounded by the tired, hungry royal family, and the officers of their guard now effectively hostages. As the carriage was jostled and slowed by the immense surging crowd, you saw faces contorted with rage shouting obscenities at the Queen. You saw the heads of the murdered guards on pikes. You arrived in Paris at the Tuileries Palace, which was to be the new gilded prison for the monarchy. Versailles was a fortress of ceremony. The Tuileries is a political cage. The palace hadn't been a royal residence for decades. It was cold, dusty, and uncomfortable. Most importantly, it lacked the intricate, labyrinthine secret passages of Versailles. The royal family is under constant surveillance by the Revolutionary National Guard, commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette. Every entrance is watched, every movement noted. Your job continues, but it is deeply altered. You are still the Queen's maid, but your duties are now performed under the watchful, hostile gaze of revolutionary guards posted just outside the chamber doors. The etiquette has collapsed entirely. The formal lever is a memory. The Queen often dresses herself in simple clothes, though she still requires you to manage her increasingly simple wardrobe and keep the rooms clean. The absurdity of trying to maintain royal standards, like ensuring the silver is spotless, while the very concept of royalty is being publicly dismantled, is soul-crushing. You are a spy by proxy. The guards interrogate you about the Queen's mood, her conversations, and her plans. If you tell them nothing, you are deemed disloyal to the nation. If you tell them too much, you are a traitor to the Queen. You learn to speak in bland, non-committal phrases, offering up only the most tedious details about laundry and meals. Life at the Tuileries is dominated by waiting. You wait for the morning to pass without an incident. You wait for news from the National Assembly. You wait for your pay, which is now even more erratic. You wait for the royal family to make a terrible mistake. You serve the Queen, who still manages to maintain a dignified calm, occasionally sewing or reading, but whose eyes betray a profound, almost paralyzing despair. The world outside the palace is now the only reality. You hear the news of the seizure of church, lands the increasing power of the revolutionary clubs, and the flight and seizure of nobles. Every day brings a new decree that chips away at the authority of the king. You realize that your entire profession's maid in the Queen's service is becoming obsolete. The concept of absolute monarchy is dissolving, and with it your place in the world. You look at the Queen, whose elaborate pouf has long since been replaced by simple bonnets, and you feel a strange mix of pity and fear. She is no longer the magnificent, toxic centerpiece of Versailles. She is merely a woman, trapped, whose life depends on the political whims of the people outside. And your fate? The fate of a servant is inextricably tied to hers. You are a passenger on a sinking ship still polishing the brass. The Ancien Régime is over. Here is your mainstream historical fact. The royal family lived under effective house arrest at the Tuileries Palace from October 1789 until their attempted escape in June 1791, known as the Flight to Vermin. This period was crucial, as it gave the revolutionaries time to draft the new French constitution and restructure the entire political system. The quirky or fringe tidbit you learn at the Tuileries is about the security measures. The few loyal servants, including members of the king's old guard, often had to disguise themselves as ordinary palace staff, like cooks or footmen, just to remain close to the royal family and attempt to maintain some level of security and communication with the outside world. And finally, the open scholarly debate phrase, Historians still argue whether King Louis XVI's acceptance of the new constitution and his public displays of revolutionary sympathy were genuine attempts to transition France into a constitutional monarchy or simply calculated tactical delays intended to buy time for a royalist escape or a foreign military intervention. Your service continues day after day in this suffocating atmosphere. You keep the Queen's few belongings tidy. You fetch water, you watch the guards, and you wait for the final, inevitable hammer to fall. The glory is gone, the terror remains, and the only certainty is that this long, strange chapter of history is hurtling toward its violent end. The day ends. The palace is hushed not with the courtly quiet of Versailles, but with a cold, watchful silence. The Queen is asleep or pretending to be. You slip back to your tiny, cramped pallet, listening to the muffled sounds of the Revolutionary Guards' heavy boots patrolling the corridor just outside. There is nothing left to do now but rest. Your tired eyes close, and the relentless pressure of history begins to ease just a fraction. All the gilded mirrors, the oppressive silks, the stench of unwashed bodies masked by perfume, the terror of the staircase, the whispers of treason. It all begins to fade into the soft haze of memory. You are safe now away from the demanding bells and the heavy whalebone corsets. Let the cold stone of the Tuileries become soft and warm beneath you. Let the fear of the mob turn into the gentle, distant hum of a slow-moving carriage. Feel your muscles relax, your breathing slow and deepen. Every breath out carries away a little more of the stress, the fatigue, the fear. The weight of the Ancien Régime is lifting from your shoulders. The silence is settling in. You are just a maid, and for now your work is done. Nothing bad can happen in the darkness. Sleep. Just sleep. Sweet dreams.